Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the United Nations Association of the United States of America, commonly called UNA-USA? How does UNA-USA work to inform people in the United States about the various activities at the United Nations, such as working to eliminate the scourge of war, promoting economic and social development, and enhancing human rights? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to take a look at the United Nations and many of the activities that impact people in the United States and around the world, and also look at an organization, the United Nations Association, that works to disseminate information about the United Nations. My guest today is an expert on both of these groups. My guest today is Mr. Chris Whatley. Chris Whatley, a U.S. national, is the Executive Director of the United Nations Association of the USA. Before joining UNA-USA, Mr. Whatley served as Deputy Executive Director and Washington Office Director of the Council of State Governments. He began his career as a field-based program officer for the International Republican Institute, running democracy assistance projects in Liberia, Nigeria, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. Chris Whatley, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. Chris, let's jump right into it. United Nations Association of the USA, UNA-USA. What is it about? What does it do?
UNA-USA is a grassroots, membership-based association which is really dedicated to two things. First and foremost, it's dedicated to promoting strong U.S. engagement within the UN system. And what I mean by that is supporting the U.S. paying its dues into the UN system, supporting our voluntary contributions to the programs and specialized agencies of the UN system, and also the ratification of treaties. Basically, our members want to ensure that the U.S. is a strong participant in the UN system and has a seat at the table. Now, in addition to that, we also have a strong public education mission. We work through education programs, but also just events at our chapters in 120 cities across the United States to kind of tell the story of the UN to a U.S. audience about what the UN is, but also more importantly, what it does, what it's doing through its specialized agencies every day around the world.
Mm-hmm. And you are a membership-based organization. You have about, 18,000 members now, and you're part of the UN Foundation, which was set up by Ted Turner, 15 years ago or
Indeed.
Something like that.
Yeah.
How do you interact with the UN Foundation?
Well, our partnership with the UN Foundation is just a fantastic one. UNA was its own separate association for many years, and through a strategic alliance became part of the UN Foundation about 3 years ago. And basically what it allows us to do is to focus on our grassroots mission. The UN Foundation is an amazing organization dedicated to supporting the UN directly through funding a whole range of initiatives, some of them focused on climate change, a lot on global health. There's a big focus on gender as well, and also helping the UN connect to innovations through connections with entrepreneurs, through media leaders and other communication strategies. It has all of these wonderful programs that are designed to support the UN directly and also supports strong U.S. leadership within the UN. For us, it allows us to connect our grassroots mission, our grassroots membership, who share a similar commitment to the UN, to the great work that the UNF itself does with our UN partners.
Mm-hmm. And full disclosure, I've been involved with UNA-USA for many, many years.
You have.
And the one advantage I've found, well, many advantages, but one is that you get objective information about the United Nations. It's very difficult to learn about the United Nations. The media in the United States and probably other parts of the world do not cover the UN very well. They focus on the Security Council or peacekeeping, and it's almost at times to the exclusion of the 80% of the humanitarian efforts of the UN to work with refugees or to team up with Rotary International to eliminate the scourge of polio, to be involved in a variety of other activities like with Kiwanis International on the iodine deficiency disorder, or working with Lions International on vision programs. But this is a good source, and of course viewers can go to www.unausa.org to get more information about the United Nations Association. Now, you're also part of a larger organization called WFUNA, the World Federation of United Nations Associations. Very briefly, what is that?
Basically, there are about 100 different United Nations associations around the world. 100 of the 193 UN member nations have a similar association. Now, they're not all the same, that many of them aren't membership-based. Often they are a nonprofit that's focused largely on sharing information about the UN, but without chapters all around their country. But many of them are very similar models to UNA USA, whether that's Canada or Tanzania. There are a number of nations who have a similar model of trying to create grassroots networks of UN supporters within their country. And WFUNA acts as the umbrella body to kind of bring together all of us to work on issues that we share, like access for civil society within the UN system. We are civil society organizations ourselves, and sharing information on new developments within the UN, so that our members, as you say, because for the United States and for many other countries, there's a huge need for direct and accurate information on the UN, and to tell the story just in a compelling way. The story that those who are here in New York and can see the work of the UN in a very direct way have that access all the time. We need to be able to take that message to our member constituencies, whether that's in the US or whether that's in any of the other 100 UNAs around the world.
Now, you have United Nations in your name, but you are not part of the United Nations. You're totally separate. But it seems that the members of UNA USA, the ones I've interacted with anyway, seem to believe that the United Nations, even though it's not a perfect organization, it has its warts and imperfections, is still, as Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State, said, an indispensable organization, because you need an organization that brings together the 193 governments of the world, the civil society, non-governmental organizations, service groups, as I mentioned a minute ago, to work on these international problems, because no one can solve them by him or herself. We've got to work together on these. And of course, the UN provides basic services like helping to move mail, weather information, to move ships on the high seas, to move aircraft in international airspace. These are all basic services that we take for granted, but somebody has to do it, and the UN is involved in doing this.
No, I think that's a great point, Phil. Often we have an inability in the United States anyway, to see the role of the UN in the major stories that are gracing our newspapers or consuming our news feeds on our cell phones. Things like the tragic loss of the Air Malaysia flight, which is going on right now as we speak today. Behind that story and behind the tragedy of it and the mystery of what's happened to that airliner is a UN entity. You have the International Civil Aviation Organization based in Montreal that sets safety standards, that set protocols that are, those are the elements that are enabling the investigators to figure out what's happened in this tragedy and perhaps avert the next one. And that's just one example. And something like ICAO has a huge impact on jobs in the United States. Companies like FedEx and UPS, who have huge global hubs, one in Memphis, one in Louisville, Kentucky, they employ tens of thousands of people. That entire industry is made possible through a number of UN protocols and agencies that facilitate that kind of transportation, that facilitate that quick movement of goods across international boundaries and the services necessary to make it happen. So that's just one example. But then you raise that other example of just kind of the compelling development and disaster response work of the UN. And I would say that within that, one of the stories that just resonates most with me as a parent, in addition to being a supporter of the UN, is that 60% of the children around the world are vaccinated through UN programs or UN coordinated programs. Often it's not just a WHO or UNHCR or UNICEF worker in the field, it's a Rotarian, you know, it's a partnership between a local Rotary member and a Rotary member from Cincinnati, Ohio, but it's coordinated all through the UN, and that's 60% of all the children in the world, not the poor children or not the children in the global south, but all the children. And I think that any parent would see in that something that speaks to their heart, but also speaks to their self-interest. Because when a child goes unvaccinated for polio anywhere, that's a threat to my own children, as well as something that strikes me as an injustice that needs to be addressed. And it's those stories of the UN, their role behind the scenes in our lives here in the United States, but the kinetic things that they're doing around the world that we love to be able to share.
Exactly. These are the hands-on services that make a difference in the lives of people. It's not just a bunch of bureaucrats talking about, well, we should do this, that, or the other. They're doing it and they're making it happen. And a lot of these people, the UN people in the field, are really in harm's way. Obviously, many of the 100,000 peacekeepers, or many of them are in harm's way. But you take some of the people who work for the World Food Program or for the UN Children's Fund, we see that they get shot at, they get robbed, some of them get killed. It's a very serious situation. But they really do a Herculean job overall.
Without doubt. And you mentioned all of those frontline workers, certainly peacekeepers specifically. If you look at a place like South Sudan right now, where you've got a peacekeeping presence that's basically holding the line against chaos that they're facing from both sides, from the rebels, but also some hostility on the government side as well. But basically, you have 20,000 plus refugees whose lives depend on a UN peacekeeping mission that's a very forceful mission. That's a different kind of mission than I knew 20 years ago. We're at the 20th anniversary of the tragedy of Rwanda, and you mentioned that the UN has its flaws, and certainly as we look back across that history, there are things that we look back on with regret. But the UN has learned so many of those lessons since then. The kind of peacekeeping presence that's going on in South Sudan is kinetically protecting those refugees. They're what stands between them and great harm. And the Central Africa mission that the Secretary General's called upon to back up the AU peacekeepers and the French peacekeepers that are there. That's once again, that's the UN stepping in forcefully to address a possible potential tragedy on a scale that would shock us all. And there are UN peacekeepers who lose their lives every year to make that kind of protection possible, along with those other frontline workers who are delivering the food, who are delivering the logistics necessary to address those immediate needs.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations Association of the USA and how it works to inform people in the United States about the various, well, really issues and projects of the United Nations and goals to eliminate the scourge of war, to promote economic and social development, and to enhance human rights. My guest today is an expert on both organizations. My guest today is Mr. Chris Whatley. Mr. Chris Whatley is the Executive Director of the United Nations Association of the USA. Chris, we're talking about peacekeeping. Before we get too far off peacekeeping,
you bet.
We think back to 1945 when the charter was adopted, June 26, 1945 in San Francisco, California. There was no mention of peacekeeping in the charter that I recall. But in 1948, the UN had its first peacekeeping mission, and that was to be an observer, to observe the Arab-Israeli conflict. But today, we see that there are over 100,000 peacekeepers in the field, more or less. You have about 15 missions. One in Sierra Leone is about ready to declare victory and fold up and go home, which it should. But how do you, when you're talking to people in the United States, how do you explain to them how important it is for UN peacekeeping in far distant areas of the world? And it's important for the people, obviously, in South Sudan or Darfur or Haiti or wherever it might be. But why is it important for the person who's living in Louisville, Kentucky, or Peoria, Illinois, or in Los Angeles, California? How do you make that connection?
I think that's a really good point. And my organization is a group of Americans who support the UN. But they also know that to do that, to share the story of what the UN does, they have to connect what the UN does to U.S. national interests. They have to tell that story of why peacekeeping matters, not just to stabilizing conflicts around the world and to the fortunes of folks in South Sudan or Liberia, a place where I spent a good chunk of time myself, but to folks in Texas, where my roots are, or from Washington State or California or Vermont at the same time. And the story there is that our investment in peacekeeping, the 28% of the peacekeeping budget that is paid for out of U.S. taxpayer dollars, is one of the best investments that we as a nation can make in our own national security. In that There are so many commitments around the world, so many places of instability where terror, where disease can spread in the midst of state failure. And the best recipe for addressing that we have as a world system right now is UN peacekeeping. So in places like Liberia, where I worked in the 90s in the midst of civil war, it's on a trajectory to a far better place than the place I knew, in part because of UN peacekeeping, in large part because of that. That benefits us directly. In a place like Mali, where you have a very important, forceful peacekeeping mission. And when I say forceful, I mean just one that was deployed in response to a real chaotic situation that has incurred casualties, that has a lot of risk involved. That mission's there because we requested it. We were one of the nations who requested it, and we requested it in part because as the government fell in Mali, as you had a coup and a chaotic environment, an al-Qaeda-aligned rebel movement set up shop in Mali, used it as a staging area into Algeria in a dramatic attack that left 3 Americans dead. A host of other foreign national and Algerians were killed as well. That peacekeeping mission addresses the direct security needs of the United States, as well as offering peace and security to the people of Mali.
A minute ago, we were talking about the UN Foundation and the lack of information about the United Nations. And there's another website our viewers can go to, and that's www.unfoundation.org. And they can sign up for what's called the UN Wire. And that's an electronic update every day, Monday through Friday, you get with some major articles about international issues, some of them pertaining to the UN, but just about every issue, no matter what you pick, it doesn't matter what it is, from climate change to trade across the board. The UN's dealing with it in some way, shape, or form, but it's a very good resource to get additional information about the UN. Now, the polls, if we go back to 1945 and the founding of the UN, you look at the Roper poll, the Harris poll, you look at the Worthland poll, pick a poll, it doesn't matter. They generally support, they show that the American public supports the United Nations, usually anywhere from 44 to about 85%, depending upon the topic. But they also, the polls show that we do not understand the United Nations. We think it's a good idea to share responsibilities, to share costs, that type of thing, but it's very important to try to look at the UN and to see what it does, because it does impact our lives. But now you're working with a group, Model United Nations students, middle school, high school, college students who are involved in a program that started back in 1919, about the time of the League of Nations. What is the Model UN program, and what is your involvement?
Model UN, I think, is one of the best education experiences that a young person anywhere in the world could be part of. And about 100,000 Americans go through Model UN in the United States, maybe 250,000 individuals worldwide in Europe, Asia, and the United States as well go through it every year. And what it really is a simulation of the United Nations itself, whether that's the General Assembly or ECOSOC or a crisis committee environment that looks a lot like a Security Council meeting. It is really taking young people, exposing them to the rules and procedures of the UN, because anyone in the UN system knows that this organization made up of sovereign states really depends on procedure and protocol and decorum to make it function. And it exposes those kids to those same kind of procedures and protocols which benefit them individually. They walk away with fantastic powers of persuasion and communication skills and critical thinking, things that for us in the United States, where we're trying to make our education system more competitive so that we can compete and succeed in this global economy, they walk away with the skills they need to do that individually. But they also walk away as perhaps the best advocates, the best spokespeople for what the UN is. And sometimes we have to talk about what the UN is and what it does. And those Americans and those citizens of other countries who go through the Model UN experience, I think they truly understand the Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the way the UN interacts as a system of sovereign states better than anybody else, and can convey that to their home constituencies better than anybody else. They're also the kind of audience that we need to look to call upon to tell the story of what the UN does, what it's doing in those peacekeeping missions, what the World Food Program's doing to address crisis and disaster. So that constituency of young people, whether they're here at home in the United States or around the world, are a real benefit to the whole UN system and all of those who support it, like myself.
Exactly. Now you have many, many programs. We'll never get through all of them today, but let's touch briefly on a couple that you have in UNA USA and the UN Foundation. One is Family Planning 2020. What is that? What's that about?
Family Planning 2020 is one of a number of programs that the UN Foundation invests in to address reproductive health, often in partnership right alongside UNFPA and other UN agencies, but to support those, the programming of UN specialized agencies to address family planning needs around the world. It's one of the biggest priorities within the foundation.
Mm-hmm. What is the Girl Up program?
Girl Up is a fantastic new program. I happen to have young daughters myself, so this one is one that I'm particularly biased to. But what it's doing is there is a tremendous focus right now as we think about what the new set of development goals will be to replace the Millennium Development Goals, to address gender as a key investment in moving forward the entire development agenda, to really addressing extreme poverty, to addressing global health challenges. If you invest in the education of girls in particular, it is a catalytic strategic investment. And what the Girl Up program does is it mobilizes Americans and others around the world. They're increasingly having programs and outreach to other countries as well, to show how important those investments are to changing the trajectory of the fight against extreme poverty worldwide, and showing how even limited investments in the education of a young girl in Guatemala or a young girl in Malawi can make a huge difference in their entire communities, and mobilizing funds to support those programs, from school groups raising $100 at a bake sale, or finding partnerships with other philanthropists to make even larger investments. It's a fantastic way that an individual American, even an 11-year-old like my oldest daughter, can play a direct role in supporting the work of the UN in the field, through UNICEF programs and others, because those funds that they raise benefit those directly.
Exactly. And many of these programs and projects can be done very cheaply, very inexpensively, and there's one that can be done extremely inexpensively, Nothing But Nets. What is that program about?
I think that's a great one. It began with a recognition that by a great sports writer that for the investment of $10, you could save a life. For the cost of a single malaria net, and I know you've worked in places where malaria is rampant, I have as well, and you recognize that the width of a mosquito net is the width of consequence for your life, in terms of whether you're going to end up with malaria, whether your children could end up with malaria, and that for $10, a modest investment, that individuals around the world could save a life, could be part of the global malaria initiative to address malaria as a major global health challenge. Nothing But Nets raises funds to support the purchase of malaria nets through innovative partnerships with the NBA, with Major League Soccer, and also by individual school groups and small community groups getting together. Pretty much any day of the week, you're going to find a Nothing But Nets event going on somewhere in America, where a small group of people are getting together. They're telling the story of how important malaria is as a global health challenge, and how this is one that we can fix if we invest enough. And they're raising money to get nets in the hands of refugee camps through UNHCR, of other programs through UNICEF. It's one of the most direct ways that an individual who wants to make a specific difference in the life of somebody in a developing country, in direct partnership with the UN, it's one of the best ways that you can make a difference like that.
Now, Chris, you've worked overseas. You've seen the UN. You've seen UN operations from another side. You're involved with the United Nations Association of the USA, not part of the UN. But as you look at the United Nations overall, there have been great strides that have been made. There's still areas of weakness in the UN system. Reform is a word that's constantly being used at the UN, like any organization. But as you look at the UN, what do you see as one of the major challenges or areas where they could focus upon to strengthen and to make the UN more efficient and to make it more effective?
I think the Secretary General has already made a big investment in accountability. And certainly from our side, I approach this as an American would, and as somebody who focuses on the perspective of the UN from our Congress. And one of the points we always make is it is so important for us to be at the table in UN specialized agencies, to be a participant and play the leading role that we should, and to pay our dues, because that's the best leverage we have to ensure that UN agencies spend their money wisely, that they are transparent in their expenditures, that they hold to the highest ethics standards possible. And you have great U.S. ambassadors like David Lane, the U.S. ambassador to the food agencies in Rome, who's working there hand in hand with new leadership at FAO, who've gone through a whole series of management efficiencies to do those very things, to be transparent in their spending, to be efficient in their spending, to introduce innovation that the private sector uses. But we got to be there at the table to do that. And fortunately, the Secretary General has been very focused on that agenda. I think it's a good story.
Exactly. And if you're not setting the agenda, somebody else will be setting the agenda. There's no such thing as a vacuum. Somebody will fill that vacuum. But the United Nations is critical. Again, as we talked a few minutes ago, it's not a perfect organization, but it's still the only place, the only international organization that brings 193 governments of the world together and focuses on all of these problems, the whole myriad. And we see that there's more and more involvement of groups such as service clubs, the private sector, businesses are getting involved in the United Nations, and they're working on these problems together because they know we have to deal with climate change, we have to deal with polio, we have to deal with other health problems, we have to deal with a variety of issues that no one group can deal with by themselves. But Chris Whatley, Executive Director of the United Nations Association, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
It's my great pleasure, Bill.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.